I love words. I love the English language. And I've been talking, I suppose, ever since I could walk, or perhaps before. I'm the son of a lawyer and the father of a lawyer. My son actually has twice been public speaking champion of the world. He is a barrister and a brilliant speaker. And he and I, in fact, have done a course called Mastering the Art of Public Speaking. But I've been speaking professionally for more than 50 years. And I began at school, entering competitions as a public speaker. And then when I went to Oxford University, I became president of the Union, the debating society. And it was then a kind of kindergarten for aspiring politicians. All sorts of people like Edward Heath, former Prime Minister, Tony Benn had been president of the Union. And I became president of the Union. And as a result of that, as soon as I came down from Oxford, I was picked up by a speakers agency run by a man called Cyril Fletcher. He was a famous comedian in his day, also a famous pantomime dame. And I became the youngest member of his associated speakers circuit, age 22. I was set out onto the world. And I remember there was an annual event that took place at the Dorchester Hotel where we all turned up, all the speakers came, and they were very distinguished, internationally famous people who were there, and then there was me. And we were color-coded according to price. So you arrived, and you know the real stars were gold, and then there was sort of green, and then there were, and I was a kind of murky brown as the cheapest person. I think I was £30. Seemed quite a lot of money to me. And we paraded around, and we were selected. People came up to you and say, "What do you talk about?" And in those days, there was a big ladies' luncheon club market, and the first speeches I did were entirely to rooms full of women wearing hats. In the late 60s, early 1970s, women still had lunch, several hundred of them together in the dining room, all wearing hats, often with plumes in them. So my introduction to public speaking was seeing seas of women with bobbing hats. So I've been speaking professionally all these years, and I then became a member of Parliament, and now, I suppose, I spend, though I do a variety of things, you know, as a journalist, as a broadcaster, as an actor, I suppose 100 times a year at least, I'm out there speaking. And I love doing it because it presents me with an engagement with life. I mostly now do corporate events. The ladies' luncheon clubs, sadly, on the whole, don't exist. And I do a lot of corporate gigs around the world. And it's very privileged because you sit at the top table with the chief executives, the top people in the top firms in the world. So you get to know what's happening, what's worrying people, what the trends are. But also, if you're like me, what I love to do at these events, and I always do, is I try to visit every table during the evening, both to see the whites of their eyes, to see what they really like, see, you know, the mix, the gender mix, the age mix, but also to find out what they're thinking, what's worrying them. And the world you meet when you go out as a speaker is a bit different from the world you read about in the newspapers or see on television. Up close, it's a better world. People are achieving rather more. You know, if you read the newspapers, you'd think that engineering in the United Kingdom was dead. It isn't. The right kind of engineering is thriving. You discover things as a speaker. Essentially, in the speaking line, I do three things. I do after-dinner speaking, which I hope is good-humoured, good-hearted, and is always aimed at being a celebration of whoever I'm with. For me, the key is them, not me. And so I very much try to make what I say relevant to that audience, and I spend time with them beforehand on the night meeting them. I do an awful lot of award ceremonies, which again I love because it's celebratory. You're meeting the best of the best. There's a great atmosphere in the room, and you discover things about an industry, a world you didn't know, and it's heartening. It's also quite moving, actually. Award ceremonies are quite moving because as the people come up onto the stage and you shake their hand and you say something fun to them, often they've got tears in their eyes, and you can see that this award means a great deal to them. And so that's humbling and exciting. And that I find quite a challenge, getting the balance right between keeping the energy going, because some of these award ceremonies, the one I did in Athens the other night, there were 90 awards. Can you imagine? Sometimes only a dozen. But you've got to keep the energy going, and also, as the evening wears, award ceremonies are a strange event, because at the beginning of the evening, everyone's high, because they all think they're in with a chance. But as the evening wears on, more and more awards are given away. Gradually, more and more people in the room realise they haven't won at all. We bought this table under a misapprehension. So they could turn hostile. So you've got to keep them on side. So I love the challenge of award ceremonies. Keynote addresses I've come to in recent years, and it's very different what I do for keynote addresses. I do two, essentially, though I vary them. One is based on the work I did on happiness. When I lost my seat in the House of Commons, I felt a failure. I felt disappointed in that. I'd loved being a Treasury minister. It was an exciting thing to do. And I was faced with the failure in my career in midlife. It also coincided with my father dying, my brother dying, my sister dying, and my best friend from school dying, all in the same period. And I felt low. And I thought, but this is ridiculous. You've got everything. You've got a wife who still talks to you, you've got children, grandchildren on the way. Come on. So I went to see a psychiatrist, a man called Anthony Clare, did a radio program called In the Psychiatrist's Chair. And we began talking about my parents. Because inevitably, when you slip into the psychiatrist's chair, they ask you to talk about your parents. And I asked him this. I said to him, why, Dr. Clare, do my parents talk about the Second World War as the happiest time of their life? Because my mother during the Second World War, my older sisters were all babies. She lived in London. Bombs were falling. Happiest time of her life. My father, for 6 years during the war, he was in the army, on the front line, risking his life for 6 years, talks about it as the happiest time of his life. Why do people of that generation, my parents, your grandparents' generation who went through the war, why so often do they talk about it as the happiest time of their lives? And he said that's easy to explain. He said, people like your mother, yes, they were in London, bombs were falling, but there was a sense of community spirit, a sense of common purpose, of unity, of shared values and ethos, and that makes people feel united and happy. And your father, yes, he was risking his life for 6 years. The soldiers, the sailors, the airmen and women during the Second World War, they were, year in, year out, risking their lives. But they were also being tested. And all the research, he said to me, all the research shows that being tested is a key element to being happy. Very few people are happy or just sitting around not doing very much. An engagement with life is essential to happiness. And that's when I began to realize, actually, this thing about happiness isn't what I thought it was going to be. And I began to explore what makes people happy. And indeed ended up with the 7 secrets of happiness. One of the most key is not resisting change. And I do resist change. As a person, I loathe change. I am a conservative with a small c and a big C. Change is not for me. I do not like the 21st century. I have to tell you, all the gizmos of the 21st century are beyond me. I do not wish to learn another frigging password. But I'm wrong. I should embrace change. Change is good for us. Change is the salt in the soup of life. Rocking the boat is good for you. Change is good. And change is also inevitable. If you resist change, you will be unhappy. And I discovered all these things that I've learned are very useful in business. For many people in business, the challenge of change is the greatest challenge. And leadership is not simply about forging ahead. It's about taking people with you and together building and leading a successful business. And a successful business, I think, needs to be a happy business. And happy businesses are more successful than unhappy ones. You kindly mentioned career highlights. I'm looking forward to some of those. I certainly have been appearing on television off and on since the 1960s. My first TV appearance was on a program called Panorama when I was interviewed by Robin Day. So I began at the top and I've gradually worked my way down over the years. I loved doing TVAM in the 1980s. I used to wear colourful jumpers on television. I tell the story of when I arrived at the House of Commons, hoping nobody would remember my colourful knitwear from my TVAM days. But unfortunately, the first person I encountered in the chamber was John Prescott, a man who I rather admire. If you don't know who I mean, he was a former Deputy Prime Minister, a man who uses the English language like a Rubik Cube, very entertaining speaker, but amateur pugilist as well. Good guy. His parents were constituents of mine. Anyway, I got up to speak wearing a regulation grey suit, hoping nobody would remember my famous woolly jumpers. And from the opposition front bench, John Prescott began barracking me, going, "Woolly jumper, woolly jumper." Well, I had to struggle on. It's nerve-wracking speaking in the House of Commons. And particularly when there is John Prescott barracking you. On I went with what I hoped was a Churchillian oration, but on he went with his barracking, "Woolly jumper, woolly jumper." Well, eventually I had to pause and point out to Mr. Prescott that the joy of a woolly jumper is that you can take it off at will, whereas the blight of a woolly mind is that you're lumbered with it for life. Of course, he did get the last laugh because he became Deputy Prime Minister and ended up in the House of Lords, whereas I'm here. But actually, to be honest, there's nowhere I would rather be, because what my life now allows me is incredible variety and the privilege of meeting all manner of men and women, and that is completely fascinating. We only pass this way once. I interviewed the Queen of Denmark some years ago, and she told me that when she was a teenager, her father had said to her, "You're going to be queen one day, and you will go to an awful lot of state banquets, and you will sit next to people who you think are very dull, and you can either sit back in your seat and be bored and have a dull life, or you can sit forward and be interested. And anyone you meet has always got at least one extraordinary story to tell. Make it your job to discover that extraordinary story." So whenever I go to a dinner and I sit down and I turn to the person on my right, I think of the Queen of Denmark, and I think, who is this guy? Okay, he's running this firm of accountants, he's running this chemical company, she's an advertising agent, she's Britain's leading female peer, but what's her most extraordinary story? And I try to discover it, and I do. So for me, every night is rewarding.